Hello, Brian. It's so nice to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, let's talk just a little bit at the beginning about the setting. This book takes place in Western Virginia, U.S. slave South, where Cather was actually born and raised as a little girl. Um, but she chooses to write here about an earlier pre-Civil War, antebellum Virginia. Why do you think she chose to do that?
My guess would be that she wanted to write something about race relations in the South, and she didn't want it to be too topical for fear of the book seeming political. And so if she said it before the Civil War, then she can kind of, there are lots of accepted things I think that people in the 30s would have accepted as kind of reality that if she said it in the 1930s and 1920s might have been harder for her to I think write about as freely. Even though, am I wrong in saying that she didn't want this book, or was it just her letters she didn't? She did. I'm sorry, it's her
Right.
letter she didn't want published, not this book. Okay, sorry, I got that
Mm.
confused.
This was one of, I think it's one of her bestsellers while she was alive, interestingly. Um, yeah, I think you're right that she really wants to talk about race relations and the cruelty and the evil of slavery. But at the
Right,
same time, this book has a lot of nostalgia as she's looking back on a place that she loved as a little girl and that she'd heard
right,
stories about.
right. It really does. And I don't remember what year it was published in relationship to Gone with the Wind, but it's kind of a I think she kind of intentionally sets it among a community in that kind of western part of Virginia where slave ownership was not incredibly common. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that comes up with Sapphira, that she kind of brings her slaves that she had inherited, her enslaved people she'd inherited with her, and that even the white people in that community kind of have a kind of a negative view of that. And I think that might be kind of a message I'm not sure that Cather's trying to get across, that it wasn't, and it wasn't, slave ownership wasn't monolithic, and not every place in the South was driven by plantation economy or those kind of things. But that feels a little bit like, if I do it this way, or if I talk about this and I said it in this community, and that, she was familiar with that community, then maybe it was a little bit, she could like introduce more sympathetic Southern characters than maybe you could otherwise, unless you wanted to go the Margaret Mitchell way and just, make them all sympathetic.
Yeah, this book came out 1 year after Gone with the Wind,
Oh,
I
wow.
think. And there are quite a number of parallels. Maybe we can talk about that at the end. Yeah, she's rooting this in an area where white people are on different sides of this issue. And that this was an area that not everyone participated in the Civil War, that areas very nearby actually seceded from the South
Right.
and joined, new free
Right.
states.
West Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah. So, she was the slaveholder. Her husband was a miller, and he had grown up much poorer and not a slaveholder. And she continues to be the owner, although he has control over what she does
Right.
with her property. She's ill. She has dropsy, which
Right.
I guess is a edema that is probably based on congestive heart failure.
Yes, I believe that's true. I'm not real good on medical stuff, but I believe that's true. And that's why blood and fluid doesn't circulate properly, I think.
So she can't really walk.
Right.
And for that reason, and for other reasons, her husband has left their bedroom, and he now is sleeping in a room in the barn, although he comes in every day to have meals with her.
Right.
And it seems like their relationship has really disintegrated. Um, and she suspects that he's having an affair or a sexual relationship with her very young, enslaved, mixed race personal servant.
Right.
Um, why do you think she has that fear?
I think because I think in a sense, and this was one of the things I really think I admired the most about the book and kind of being courageous. We can talk about the ways, and we have a little bit about the ways in which maybe she pulled some of her punches. But I think in terms of her willingness to address the issue that uh, enslaved women were preyed upon by white men in such a regular fashion that this woman would suspect that her husband was doing exactly that. And I think one of the kind of interesting things that we learn about her husband's name's Henry, right? One of the interesting things we learn about Henry is that he's not completely immune to that. That he and I was going to ask you, do you think the reason why he moved to the mill in the room there once his wife became ill was to separate himself to a certain extent from the enslaved women who lived in his home and shared that space with him?
That's an interesting thing. I had not thought of that. I don't think that there's any indication in the book that he has those feelings per se. I think you're absolutely right that she would have thought it because that was
Right.
the culture.
Yeah. And when his nephew, it's his nephew, comes to
Yes,
visit and he is stalking Nancy, I think her husband's reaction is really interesting. That he see, this is where I think I would disagree with you a little bit. I think in that respect, we see Cather showing the husband actually working through his feelings. Why does he like Nancy to be the one
mm,
who does his room, and why won't he let his wife sell Nancy, and why does he get so upset? And yeah, there's actually a little bit line in there where he says something about the other men in his family having done something like this and him not wanting to be that way.
right.
And so I think, I think it might have been, I don't know. I think to me, I read it as Catherine was saying, he's more challenged by this than he might appear. I think it gives him a little depth because otherwise he's
Yeah,
just this kind of virtuous, hardworking guy. I think for the most part, at the beginning seemed like a difficult wife.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I think you might be right. I tended to, instead of a sexual relationship with her, that he thought of her more as a human being, and that he felt like there was some moral obligation in this paternalistic way,
right.
um,
I think
and that
there's
that's why he didn't want to sell her. But I that romance, I mean, that she cleans his room, the
Mhm,
Nancy, the
right,
young woman, and she he talks about how she leaves flowers by his bed, and
right.
there is definitely that
Yeah, and
romantic.
it's almost to me like when his nephew came, he became aware of it. Like, I'm with you that he was not aware of it, and he was intentionally had not decided not to be that person. But somehow when his nephew showed up and his nephew is that person, he started to think to himself, you know, he seemed to question himself a little bit more and really think more seriously about why he felt the way he did about Nancy. Was it strictly speaking, as a protector, or was there something else there which was dangerous to him and his view of his own personal morality? Which
Yeah.
I think it's incredible. I mean, either way you read that, I think that character in that situation is incredibly subtle and I thought just really brilliant. And one of the things that surprised me most about the book is how engrossed I became in it so quickly. Even, I read, the only other Catholic read is My Antonia, which is great. But a lot of times in My Antonia, what you're reading for is the plains and the nature and the characters are fine and it's interesting and you're kind of caught up in will the main character and Antonia have an actual romance? But this felt so much more subtle to me. And maybe I read too much into it because I was just like, wow, this is great. And this, and was looking for too much stuff there. But I really thought that character was really interesting, as is his wife, of course.
I
The
very much agree. And talking about subtlety, I mean, it even goes down to when she's describing some extraordinarily violent acts or disturbing acts, she manages to do it in a way that comes across as almost quiet, but also very obvious what's happening. And I was
Yes.
thinking specifically about when the nephew comes. Let me see if I can find the quote. When the nephew comes, which Sapphira actually wants him to come, partly because she suspects that he will assault Nancy. And so when he does come, he finds Nancy in a cherry tree, more or less hiding from him. And he says, "Aren't you going to give me something on such a pretty day? Let's be friends." And then he climbs up a little bit, and she offers him cherries, and he says, "I don't want
Right.
cherries, they're sour, and I want something sweet." And then he grabs her. He caught her bare ankles because she's sitting in the tree slightly
Mhm.
above him, and drew her two legs about his cheeks like a frame. And she dropped her basket and almost fell out of the tree. And then he says, "This is nothing but to cure a toothache." And he sort of goes on about what he's doing is,
Right. It's
and
in,
it's very
it,
clear what's going, although,
it is, and I was, and just I was like amazed at how, I'm going to use the word erotic, sorry, how kind of the kind of erotic charge there is to that, and how like uncomfortable you as the reader are. I mean, it's not a kind of eroticism where you're like,
right,
you're interested in that way, but you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. And how I was thinking, how is she going to get out of this? How is
right,
she going to avoid being assaulted more than she already was being?
right,
And yeah, that was just that scene is just really. I'm glad you brought that one up, because that scene is just really one of those in the book which I just thought was extraordinary, and how carefully and yet clearly she tells us what's happening, or what the potential is for that scene, and how scary then it becomes, I thought.
yeah, yeah. There's the scene when Henry is reading his Bible and trying to find verses that would condemn slavery, and he can't find one. And he's looking hard for one. Why would he search for that? And what does it mean that Cather would include this
Okay.
place where we're seeing that the Bible doesn't condemn slavery?
I think that that's I think depending on how we want to read what Cather's up to, I think his inability to find condemnation for slavery in the Bible can be read one of two ways. You might read it as, I guess, an anti-Christian, or kind of not an anti-Christian, but as a shot taking at Christianity, that slavery wasn't condemned. You might also take it as an excuse, which lots of Southerners did, that the Bible did not condemn slavery. In fact, had lots of examples of slavery, and God giving instructions to the Israelites about how to treat their slaves. So I'm not sure which one of those two. I thought, my tendency would be to go, well, she's taking a shot at Christianity, its failure to condemn slavery, but part of me thinks it might have been the other, that she's creating that kind of gray area so that Henry can live with the situation.
Yeah.
That so if I had to choose two, that would be the one I think is most likely, even though I've never read a Cather biography. But that's what I would
She's
think.
There's a bit of a question, but it seems like she's fairly um, connected to religion by this point in her life.
Okay.
So I'm guessing that it is this feeling of trying to understand how some Southerners could still be moral in a very traditional Christian way.
Right.
That's my gut too, is that
Yeah.
it's trying to explore,
Yeah.
um, how he could live with that.
Right.
And interestingly, his daughter doesn't live with it. Their daughter
No.
doesn't live with it.
Sorry about the light. I think you want to wait for the sun to go off, or I don't want to look like I have a Renaissance painting halo behind my head. Yeah, the daughter. I now wonder if that's just because the daughter got away. Lived in D.C. And her husband was not a slave owner and didn't come from people who were slave owners. And I wonder if that kind of broke the spell for her, to a certain extent. Um, she's kind of an interesting character. I'll be honest with you. I found the whole scenes with her and the teacher and her two sick daughters in the house near the end, that confused me, I think, to a certain extent. I know that's not what we're talking about, but to a certain extent, that part kind of confused me. I didn't think that was clear to me what was going on or what the purpose of that was. I thought I knew what it was going to be, and then it wasn't that at all. So
I think there are times when Rachel is trying to help Nancy escape where she becomes almost coercive. Um, and as much as she wants to help Nancy,
mhm,
there are times where Nancy resists,
right,
who says she doesn't want to escape.
right.
And we see elsewhere in the book a couple of references to other situations kind of parallel. First of all, why would Nancy not want to leave? And why would Rachel be as controlling, maybe is the right word?
I think that that's again kind of what I think is really what's, the longer I think about it, the greatness I think of this book like slowly emerges. And just talking about it with you, I think, okay, well, why would Rachel be that way? Well, because I think she's decided to be the opposite of her mother, which, lots of us decide to be the opposite of one parent or the other. That's not unusual. And so, how is she going to be opposite? Well, she's going to be against slavery, and her mom's for it. But she is like her mother in the
Mother,
sense that she is controlling, to the extent that she is more or less, doesn't let Nancy back down, from escaping. And that scene where Nancy's like, "No, let's just go home, and I don't want to do this," and it's really kind of, you know, um, to a certain extent heartbreaking, because I think Nancy realizes that she's leaving everything she's known. She has no idea,
yeah,
and of course, a lot of enslaved people chose to stay, and chose not to leave, even when the Union Army, the United States Army, is a few miles away. And Faulkner represents that in, what am I
right.
thinking? In the Unvanquished, where some stay, and for various reasons. Now, Faulkner has people stay for completely different reasons, I think, but that leaving was scary. And
Yeah,
I think we all think, oh well, if I were in that situation, I would take advantage and go. And we're like, well, would you leave everyone, everything,
that
or did that?
horrible
Right.
choice between
Yeah.
freedom and home and all the people you love, and the
Right.
land even, which I think is important for Cather specifically.
Yes, and
Yeah,
just a world where your place, what your job is. And I think, if to a certain extent, I guess obviously, if Sapphira hadn't turned against Nancy because for what she believed Nancy was getting up to with her husband, then I'm not sure Nancy would have ever considered leaving,
right.
because she
Yeah,
wouldn't have felt threatened in any way, and she wouldn't have felt like Sapphira brought the nephew specifically to harm her, which is certainly what she believes.
yeah, yeah. Well, so you've definitely talked about some of the really progressive, shall I say, aspects of what Cather's doing and how she is quite understanding in certain ways. At the same time, there's some really troubling parts of the book. And first of all, there's the language. There's language that we're not used to reading in texts
Right.
that are more contemporary. Is that why does Catherine do that? Is it her own language? My feeling is that it's probably her effort to show how other people felt, the people there were thinking, the whites um, there. Would you?
So I don't want to assign, any kind of racism to Cather, even though we are talking about a time period. Growing up there, those would have been words that she heard, and
Mhm.
undoubtedly, I think, words that she used. at some point in her life. And I think that she would probably accurately, or covering for herself, fall back on the idea that this was realistic, that she was trying to prevent a realistic view. And I oftentimes, people say that about Faulkner or somebody else, I go, okay, well, is the author using those words in the non-dialogue parts, or is it only characters using those words? And then, and I don't remember in this case, but I believe we have, as with Mitchell, her using the racial terms in her own, the authorial voice in the book. And so I think it becomes a little harder to defend there. And I just, I'm not, I don't, I'm not
Right.
for canceling reading books or assuming that all authors are pure evil, but I do think that realistically looking at them is important,
I
because
think one reason I wanted to read this particular book with you was because we're both people who are interested in history, and that reading historical books, and realizing when they were written, and is important to us in ways
right.
that just canceling authors, if a contemporary white author were to write this kind of thing, I think both of us would have a very different feeling about what it
Yes.
meant.
That's true. And that's kind of why, I think we all set these standards for ourselves. That's kind of why I look at, is it in dialogue or is it the author? That's kind of one of my tests. And people argue with me all the time in regard to Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind, that, oh well, it's just realistic. That's what it was like. And I'm sure that's true. But when they made the movie, somehow they managed to leave all that out, or at least the most offensive of those words was left out. And so I don't think the sensibilities were quite what people think. And at the same time, I think people raised in that society would have defended it as being realistic. And it would be odd, I think, to have white slave owning characters in the South, in the antebellum South, not use bigoted language in reference. I think that would be odd, and unrealistic. So I kind of go back and forth, bring up Faulkner again, but also other Southern writers I think all have that issue somewhere in their writing, and all, I think, fail the test at some point, and at some point I think they rise above it, at least in their fiction, if not necessarily in their lives, which is one of the other things I think is true. But I'm not sure about Cather. Maybe her life was better than her fiction,
Hmm.
unlike Faulkner, for instance. Maybe that as a person, she was far more liberated from that idea than it appears in this book. But I
That's an
don't know.
interesting question. I'll think about that some more. Talk a little bit about some of the other Black characters in the book. Did any stand out for you?
So yes, Nancy's mother Till, I think, is it stood out to me because I think Cather is using her to represent the enslaved person who is completely co-opted by the system, who kind of buys into um, the system so much so that they're actually upholding the very system of their own oppression in some ways. And she appears to be oftentimes on Sapphira's side against Nancy, and has these really firm beliefs about how a household should be run and what's right and how much work you're supposed to do. So that character, and then also getting back to what Cather thinks, I think about, or Cather's position on race. I think the character of um, uh, the I can't remember the young woman's name who Henry does not want coming. I think her name's Bluebell.
Yeah.
Is it okay? That Bluebell is almost like a stand-in for the Prissy character
Yes.
from
Yes.
Gone with
That's
the Wind.
exactly.
They both seem to fit that stereotype, and I guess maybe Till fits the Mammy stereotype from Gone with the Wind. Hate to make everything about those two books, but I can't help but make those
They're really
connections.
similar, and because of the same timing, I think it's
Right. So I
funny.
do think that she has stereotypical, recognizable negatively portrayed Black characters in the book, and I think she does it on purpose, and
Yeah.
to represent kind of the variance, but also, I think we can kind of, wonder if she's also playing into the stereotypes to a certain extent.
I was really intrigued with the presence of Jezebel, who I won't go into gory detail about, but she's an elderly slave and she gets her own section. And it gives Cather a chance to talk about the history of slavery. She was born in Africa. She's brought over in the Middle Passage. Through her, we hear about that and about slave markets. I mean, it's this much larger sweep, which is an interesting choice to put that in.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd forgotten about that.
I think she's Nancy's great grandmother,
That that sounds right.
which actually makes me want to, partly because we just got a like just got a marker that our time is running out. But
Okay.
let's talk about the epilogue just a little bit, because there we have another great grandmother, great grandchild. We have the
Mhm.
5-year-old white child, Sapphira, who is in the house when Nancy comes home 25 years after she escapes and is reunited with her mother.
Right.
And this 5-year-old white kid is there to watch the whole thing, which I find, deeply troubling. What did
Yes.
you make of this?
I I found the epilogue to be a little perplexing, and I would have been okay without it. I think on the whole, I'm not sure that I got its purpose other than, it makes me wonder if Cather sees herself as the 5-year-old, if she's putting herself in that position as an observer of all these things that have happened that she's heard about.
She
Um,
says she remembers it. She
right,
even writes, I mean, she says, that was me. This whole
right,
thing was
right, yeah.
true. Yeah.
So I I think that, without it should be heartwarming and nice, and Nancy comes home when her mother's still and all those kind of things. And it is, except there's this weird little 5-year-old, white girl watching it all and commenting on it all and expressing her frustration sometimes, thinking Nancy isn't doing what she's supposed to be doing, and that feels odd.
Although I think we as readers are supposed to see that 5-year-old, she's not doing what she's supposed to be doing, as not Cather's adult perspective, at least.
Right. I think that's true.
Yeah, Toni Morrison in have you read Playing in the Dark? I haven't read it in
No, I
ages and
haven't.
ages, but I saw a reference that she refers to the story, and her argument is essentially that this is what so often happens, that white authors create Black characters that do not have, we never see inside her head. What we see is how she shapes the white characters.
Right.
Toni Morrison goes into a lot more sophisticated ideas than that, I think, but um, one of the things that I did find interesting is that instead of getting the sort of tragic mulatto story, we get this very sophisticated, distinguished Nancy coming back home.
Yeah.
And one critic actually said that that might have been the first time that Willa Cather, assuming that this story is actually true,
Mhm.
that Willa Cather really saw the possibilities of what could happen in an urban place. And that's the
Yeah.
life she chose for herself later.
Yeah.
That despite, writing about Nebraska and her young adulthood there,
Mhm.
that later in her life, she's living in New York City.
Yeah. Huh.
And I find that kind of
Yeah,
intriguing. This view.
I hadn't thought about it that way. I was just kind of like, with the epilogue, kind of like, "When this is strange, this feels," I don't know, it didn't fit, but you're saying that now, yeah, I can see that being a possibility, and particularly the idea that, why she wouldn't wanna stay or go back to that place, because of the possibilities which Nancy actually, displays in her life of living away from the South and living away from rural areas.
Compare this book to some other things you've read.
when I the first I found the comparisons of what I read were mainly to Black authors, not just because I was reading Let Us Descend, which, the more we talked about Sapphira and the Slave Girl, the more I wonder if Jesmyn Ward had studied this book, because there are so many parallels between the two. Let Us Descend is a book about grief and loss and those kind of things in a way this book isn't, but structurally there are some similarities. Even I'd forgotten about Jezebel the grandmother, but obviously in Let Us Descend you have that kind of ancestor uh presence as a spirit, I guess, more than as an actual person. But I thought that, but in the when I first caught on, I thought to or when I first started thinking about the relationship between Sapphira and her husband, and between Sapphira and Nancy and Henry, and then we have the nephew show up. And when that tension begins to build and we begin to see, Sapphira doing something that's pretty evil, if we take that she's doing what Nancy thought she was doing. I don't have any reason to think what wasn't. And then, finding out that she's not quite that thing. I thought the complexity of the characters reminded me of like Toni Morrison's characters in Song of Solomon, and how hard difficult it is to pin them down. I don't know. This is just me, but I like to find the good and the bad. My mind always goes to who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and I enjoy books where that's not clear a lot. And I was surprised that was less clear in this book than I thought it was going to be. And so I think I went on. But anyway, that kind of nuance and the characters being slowly revealed for who they are, good, bad, was really surprising to me. And there had that kind of feeling of a Morrison novel in terms of its atmosphere, I thought, to a certain extent. I think Song of Solomon would be the one I think it's most,
Yeah, that's an interesting
it
comparison.
felt like
Yeah,
the most.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and having this conversation. I appreciate
Thank,
it.
thank you, Hannah. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate you bringing this book to my interest. It's not a book I ever would have read if you hadn't asked me about it. And it was just so much, now I feel like I have to read more Willa Cather.